This video is all about a really special box. Now, this part of the box minus the lid was made years ago and I needed a certain size, so I had to cut it down. In this video, I'll show you an effective way to do that. So years ago, I used to make boxes in different species, and then later I would create a lid for whatever situation I needed. I've since used them all up except for this last one that I was saving for a special situation, but it was a little bit big. It was about 16 inches wide, 11 inches deep, or about 40 by 28 centimeters. But I needed it smaller, about 11 inches wide and 7 or 8 inches deep, or about 28 by 19 centimeters. So I cut it rough at the bandsaw to start. This is probably starting to make sense now. You can see that I can bring this box to this straight and square cleat. I've got a mark here on the box that I'll transfer here. That's how wide I will set the table saw fence. That'll ensure a good quality cut and also prevent blowout on this edge. And then I can do the other side in a similar way by adding a spacer here, a parallel spacer. So obviously this board is to raise the box off the table saw so the legs clear and it sits nice and flat. And also I decided to make a scoring cut so that the outside of the box won't chip, although this board should back it up, but I like redundancy. So the little marquee mark here is the inside dimension of this box, and I can just transfer that to this jig. And now with that known dimension, I can set the table saw fence, right? And I always have to reiterate, if you see something that I'm doing on a table saw or any machine and it doesn't seem safe to you or you don't like it, it's simple. Just don't do it. I told you I like redundancy, so in addition to this scoring cut, I'm going to offset it a slight amount, the thickness of one layer of tape, which is literally dividing 1/64 of an inch by 4. And so we'll add that tape first, we'll make the cut, then we'll remove the tape, thusly creating a slight, tiny offset, which absolutely will eliminate or ensure that we get zero chippage. And that sound you hear is my dust collector coming on. So I have 7 machines that are fully automated. With the exception of my table saw, I have a switch and I can choose whether to turn it on or not. And boom, we have a beautiful scoring cut. And of course, the other side was done the exact same way. Nice. Now we can raise the blade, and I don't want to cut too high because I don't want to cut into the box bottom, right? And of course, now we can remove the tape to ensure a beautiful cut. Here you can see I've added that spacer or backup piece to ensure that the edge doesn't chip. Beautiful. And now we just need a big hammer. Well, actually, that came off pretty easy. And as I was looking at this box, I thought, wow, I do a lot cleaner work now. But hey, we all got to start somewhere, right? It's a progression, or it should be. And here I can just mark the distance that the bottom will go into the groove on the front piece. And the same situation or a similar situation here, I've milled a chunk of wood so that I can raise the feet off the box so I have a flat condition to make this cut. Makes sense, yeah? So I can start by just making a little mark, and then I'm going to cut this chunk of walnut down so that I'm not cutting through the walnut and the bottom of the box at the same time. It's not necessary. And I have a little stop on my fence. You can see me sliding it there, and that ensures that I can set a stop, move the fence, and then I'll be able to return that to the same position. And of course we can drop the blade down to where we're just cutting through slightly over half and make these cuts in 2 passes. Now this may seem like a lot of work to cut down a box, but I was in a time crunch to create a box, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a bit. And this is a good way to do it. It ensures good quality cuts, and everything's going to come out nice and square, and all the joinery will be tight. And it certainly was faster than creating a new box from scratch. And truthfully, I should have raised the blade a little higher, but it chipped slightly, but didn't matter in the long run. All right, there you go. That's an easy way to cut down a box. The bottom is protruding slightly, just enough to go inside that groove. And now I can focus on this piece that was originally at the end of the box. It's now going to be the front or a back part. And I can cut this even closer than I had cut it at the bandsaw, and then we'll remove whatever's left. Super simple and very effective. Hopefully you don't mind a sped up video. I had to do that in a lot of these areas, otherwise it would have been way too long. So utilizing that same chunk of wood, it fits tightly between the legs. In addition, I can add this clamp to ensure that it stays put, right? And we can make this cut. And I'm just cutting right close to the leg, just leaving a sliver of wood. Don't give me any crap about that handle being close. It's a bad camera angle. I had checked. It cleared easily. So, yeah, don't you fret, Chia Pet. Beautiful, yeah. Now we can just chisel that small amount away easily. And the reason this works is because it's, you know, a smaller area that has less ability to remain intact, essentially. In other words, it's just a sliver of wood, so there's less integrity of the material left. And I can just chisel that away, and then we can smooth it nice and clean. So a couple areas were really adhered, you know, quite a bit stronger. And so again, we can do the same thing. We're going to cut those into smaller pieces, reduce their integrity until they come loose. Super simple. I'm always amazed how well this works. One positive thing about not using solid wood like this bottom in this box is that you can glue it in solid, which really adds to the strength of carcass type box construction. So this little chunk was a piece of fall off, and I thought I would use it to test for the location of the biscuits and see how all that's going to work. And a scribe is an incomparable tool in the workshop. After decades of using a scribe out in the field to, you know, scribe in cabinetry or countertops or whatever, I find myself using it in the shop all the time. It's perfect for finding centers, transferring marks. I'd say it's a very underutilized tool. Magnetic clamping pad with leather. Love those things. So I'll clamp this piece as a support for the biscuit router. Yeah. And part of the bottom is in the way there. And get rid of that. And I'd say 90 or 95% of the time I use a biscuit router, I reference off the base. If I can utilize that, it seems to be more accurate, at least with this particular brand. Here I'll just add a spacer as a spacer. So the legs will accommodate as I put it in the vise. And scribe's still set up so I can transfer that mark. And again, I'm going to use a reference off the bottom of the biscuit joiner. So I can just place this block in place. Make sure it's in alignment. Tap, tap. Check for square. Everything looks good. Let's make the cut. Now, don't give me any crap. This was made years ago, and if I was to do a box like this again, I would use integrated tenons or at least domino. But for what it is, it'll be plenty strong. And I noticed some tear out that when I first built this, I guess I was just going to leave it. I don't know. But no big shake, easy solution. I can add a little chunk of wood under here just for better support. Some sandpaper and smooth things up. Now, I typically will only go to about 180 grit when I'm using a top coat finish like lacquer or conversion varnish. It's plenty smooth and the finish gets sanded, and so you don't have to go crazy with all the grits to sand that. And with those types of finishes, you need a little bit of tooth or bite for that top coat finish to adhere or bond. And here I'm in the middle of the glue up, and I decided to use epoxy because there's end grain and I don't have integral tenons. I know the biscuit's in there, but the epoxy will bond well to end grain. I've had this board for quite a while, and I plan on slicing this up into veneer, but it had a lot of checks. So I just cut around those to create these 4 components for this frame. This should work well. So the frame will be this figured walnut, and then some walnut and maple for the marquetry. All right, so I'm going to use this maple for the background on the lid, and it's pretty thin already. I need to split it in half at the bandsaw, resaw it. But if I was just to run this against the fence, since this is so thin, it's going to vibrate a lot. So I'm going to try something. I've never done this before, but I'm going to double stick tape this thin piece to this bigger chunk to give it some mass and hopefully reduce vibration. Yeah, this worked, and it worked well. Adding that thickness made all the difference. Now, if anyone's wondering, that's a Woodmaster blade. I get mine from Spectrum Supply. It's a 1-inch wide, carbide tipped, pretty decent blade, 35 thousandths kerf, good for resawing. Then over at the drum sander, I can run these through, get all the saw marks out, and get them all to the same thickness. So here, instead of just measuring 1, I'll measure 3, knowing that my target dimension is 1/16 times 3 is 3/16. In other words, it's a cumulative effect, so any difference in thickness other than the target dimension will show up as a discrepancy, right? So the more pieces you have to divide that target dimension by, the more accurate your results will be. And technically, I suppose I should have joined these together first and then ran all the pieces through the belt, through the drum sander. But this will work, no big shake. Of course, when gluing maple, you need really good, clean seams, joints, and white glue will help as well. Then I'll add some weight to keep things flat and go work on something else. Once it's dry, just didn't take much. It was pretty flush. And boom, there's our background. So I simply just find a font that I like off the interwebs, right? And print that, blow it up to whatever scale or size I need. And then I affix that with this Easy Tack. Okay, this is exciting. This is marquetry, and this process is called the double bevel technique, where we're cutting through the maple, which is the background, and the walnut, which will be the letters, at the same time. It's hard to tell from this view, but they're being cut at an angle, and so that angle is what creates a perfect fit. And April is the name of the caregiver for our dad the last couple of years of his life, and he recently passed, and we wanted to make a gift for April just to show our appreciation for the immense amount of work that she did. All right, at this point, I've got a couple of letters cut, and I'll go ahead and put those in, because if I try to keep cutting these, this cross grain area here and here, it just gets too weak. So if I put this letter P and this I in, it'll offer more support in those areas. So I'll just peel the tape off here. The double bevel technique is such a fun process, and you know, you get into a groove where you're cutting a few pieces and then you can glue and set those in place and then continue, cut a few more. I absolutely love it. This is a cool little hammer. One face is convex and the other side is flat. So the convex side is perfect for marquetry. And you can see I have marked on the handle a straight line or a curve, so I always know which end I'm using without having to look. All right, so there's all the letters. I just need to do this negative space of the A and the P. I believe that's called the counter. Anyway, so all I do is put a couple little dabs and I'll glue those in place like that. And then I can just do the marquetry the same way. That way I end up with those little pieces and it matches the background. And
all the grain just continues really nicely like that, yeah.
There are probably other ways to do this, but this works really well. A couple little dabs and hold it down with a couple of magnets. Then I'll take the fall off from the other letters I cut and put that over the A and the P, and that way it stays nice and stable as I make the cuts. All the letters glued in, the counters of those two letters glued in place. And that, in essence, is a marquetry panel. Now this can be glued to a substrate. Oh, so I wanted to show you this real quick. This is my air nozzle here at my marquetry platform, and I can turn that on and vary the amount of air and even change the angle if I need to. It just keeps dust out of the way as I'm making the cuts. Pretty handy. I sand the panel front and back with a belt sander using 180 grit, and then I use the Festool ETS 150 with 220 grit. All right, onto the frame.
After cutting the shoulder and cheek cuts with some test pieces, the easiest way to figure out the panel length is with this proverbial method of a couple of opposing strips. I can put that in place, make sure everything's flush against the fence, bring those tight right in there, boom. And that will be the length of the panel, right? The width, I already cut that width when I cut this length. And since this is not solid wood, I can glue this in solid. I don't need room for expansion. Here's something that I bet a lot of people have never thought of, or maybe they have, I don't know, but squeeze clamps, right? And we used to use these a ton. I have literally 4 or 5 buckets full of these because when I used to do a lot of solid surface, you may have heard of Corian, solid surface, a lot of different brands out there. But anyway, when you have your main countertop, this stuff is typically available in 1/2-inch sheet form, and you cut strips and you build those up around the perimeter to make the thickness of a countertop. And when you're gluing these in place, you have blocks here to space them just right from the front, and then you clamp these with these spring clamps, right? About every 3 inches or whatever. And then when you do a return, of course, those pieces need to be tight. And with all glues, it's typically pretty slippery. And one thing that I noticed is that these clamps, this spring is wound one way. And so here, you'll notice when I clamp this, this has the propensity to move to the right. Conversely, this one moves to the left, and that's because of the way the spring is wound. So these red ones I would call left hand, and these black ones I would call a right hand. And with that dynamic, I could use a left hand one in this situation to make sure that this piece gets tight right here. Conversely, if I was doing a piece here on this side, I would need one with that right hand push, however you want to see that. And I thought of this years ago. I used to teach classes on solid surface. Anyway, I was cutting some strips so I could figure out the length of this panel. And I thought it might be a good time to share that tip. As I was clamping this stick, I was aware that this could slip those pieces. And so it's just something to keep in mind. Left hand and right hand springs.
Although in the video, you'll notice I switched to left and right hand clamp, but you get the point. And there it is, all glued up, flat, all that.
All right, Soss hinges, right? This is the larger one, a lot of different sizes, but I primarily use the 204 and the 101. The 101 is 3/8 wide, 1.11 inch. This one's 1/2 inch wide, 2 3/8. And my jig is fantastic. With this same jig, I can cut both of these mortises for these two size hinges. And that happens by, let's see, this dude slips on here and I make this cut and then this gets removed. And this is for the 101 marked in green. And then for the 204, I simply turn this piece around and then this creates a bigger cavity. Anyway, the 101 requires a setback from the edge of the door to the pivot side of the hinge. That setback, it's in here somewhere. From the door edge to the edge of the hinge for the 101 is 3/32. So I've just wrote that on my jig, 3/32 for the 101. The 204 requires an 1/8 inch. So we can cut that. I've got a sample in here and I've got a center line on my jig. And so I go off of centers to make these cuts. And if we were to take that setback of 3/32, that is, decimal is 0.094, 0.094. And since I'm going off of centers, this hinge is 3/8 wide. So half of that is 3/16. That is 0.1875, 0.1875, right? That is 2.815. So I've marked this with my scribe. This is set at 0.282. I just gave it a little bit extra. Put a mark down the center. I've lined up my jig with that center mark. And so we're set for that distance. Now our depth, that's also pretty easy. We can take this, drop the bit down until it just makes contact. Boom, right there, lock that. And then this plunge depth rod, we need to go down this first dimension, which is 3/16 plus a 32nd, driving the Europeans crazy. So 3/16 is 6/32 plus one more, 7/32. So an easy way to do that, drill bits. I can just find a 7/32 drill bit, put that in here, boom. And I know I'm going to plunge exactly 7/32 or this first step right here. And then this distance, the second step, is another, it's about 1/4 inch. It's a little bit less than 1/4. But if it's a little bit more than, you know, if I cut a little bit deeper, it's not gonna hurt anything because it won't hurt anything. So what's awesome about this is the distance from this part of the turret here to the next step is 1/4 inch. So I just utilize those two nubs. So we can make the cut.
Now, there are a multitude of ways to cut Soss hinge cavities. You could use a Shaper Origin. I believe they have files for different sizes. I was thinking of ways to utilize the Panther router, but this method is my favorite. You can see after making one cut, I add this spacer template, change the turret setting to go a little deeper, and just like that, bam, we are done.
How beautiful is that? First time, every time. And our offset, it's just a little over 3/32, which is fine because the lid hangs over the back just a tad. So it's just about right.
All right, that's cool. I'm satisfied with the sample. Same process for routing the cavities in the box, and if you look close, you'll see a little strip that I added because the legs stick out a little, and that would create a problem with the offset. So by adding that strip, I could move those hinges back. You may have heard me mention this before, but the reason I love belt sanders for a lot of things is because they sand flat. On this particular belt sander, it has about a 4 by 6 inch platen that sands dead flat. And so I can get these joints, all these areas flat, the edges aren't rounded over, everything stays nice and true. Conversely, with a DA sander or like the ETS Festool, even with a hard pad, if you were to put a straight edge across a narrow board that had just been sanded, you would notice that the edges are slightly rounded over. The belt sander, everything stays nice and flat. At this point, the lid is sanded flat, hasn't been finish sanded, and now I can route the cavities for the Soss hinges. There's another brand of this type of hinge comparable to Soss, and I've actually heard it's better. I don't really remember the name of the brand, so I'm not really sure why I opened my mouth. But I'd like to try them out. I had mentioned earlier that this box is for a girl named April, who was a caretaker for my dad for the last few years. And I like to make connections, so the walnut that this box is made out of came from a tree that my dad's dad planted in 1947. And I had milled the lumber and had this beautiful wood. I thought that would be appropriate. Since the original box had been laying around for a few years, it had a few dings and scratches, so nothing a little bit of sandpaper and a scraper can't take care of, right? And then here, just to finish sand, yes, I'm using the ETS, but I'm not taking a lot of material off. It's minimal, so any round over will be minuscule, if any. I used 2 seal coats of lacquer and then 1 top coat, final finish. And I always number my pieces, which is also the date too. I mean, also. I always like adding a little bit of wax to screws, especially delicate ones that you don't want to jack up the threads or the head, or in this case, a little bit of chapstick. And truthfully, I usually put the hinges installed before I finish the box. I must have got carried away and forgot, but this worked. Oh, and I remember that the name of that hinge is a Tectus. So if anybody has any experience with that, I'd certainly like to hear your opinion. A really fantastic option is to use a screw gun with a clutch rather than an impact, right? Much more delicate, more control, and you can set that clutch to a very light torque setting. I was super pleased with the way the Marquetry came out. There's something very special about making something by hand. Speaking of which, this is a Calla Lily that my brother Andy made. This was created from the top of an old rusty barrel lid, completely made by hand, and here you can see the stamen and that other part, a little bit of highlights made of brass. Just beautiful. So 3 days later, on the 25th, we delivered the flower in the box to April. Saw my dad one last time. He ended up passing that evening. The 25th was actually my birthday, and I just accepted this as a gift and this wonderful dynamic of relationships between my dad, his dad, the tree that he planted, working with my brother on this collaborative effort for April, and it was just a beautiful thing. And I sincerely hope that you enjoyed the process of me building this box as much as I did. And as always, thanks a ton for watching.